Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Something frosty, creaky, and historically uncomfortable. We're stepping into the chill of the darkest winters in medieval history. Yeah, it's going to be cold, grim, and kind of beautiful in a tragic way. This is the kind of history that feels more like folklore, the stories passed down by candlelight when the firewood's almost gone and the soup is mostly water. But here's the thing, you probably won't survive this. Not because of wolves or war or witches, but because medieval winter was less hot cocoa and more, hope you like mouldy bread and frostbite. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your city and what time you're tuning in. I always wonder who's drifting off with me from halfway across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So picture this. You're standing on a crooked wooden bridge somewhere in northern Europe. It's the 1300s, though no one's bothering with calendars out here. Above you, the sky's bruised grey, like a swollen ankle. Snow falls, heavy and slow, so thick it makes the silence feel alive. You're wrapped in a wool cloak, rough and damp from the last week's weather. Your boots are stiff with ice, and your hands, even tucked into your sleeves, feel like they've been gnawed on by the cold itself. This isn't one of those it's chilly but charming kind of winters. This is survival mode, the kind of cold where windows frost inside, where ink freezes in the pot before you can finish writing a sentence. You shuffle past skeletal trees, the occasional crow, and a man frozen in prayer at the steps of a crumbling chapel. You can't tell if he's alive or if he's just still. The thing is, winters back then weren't predictable. They weren't even seasonal half the time. You might get a mild December and then get slapped with snowdrifts in April. There's no pattern. It's chaos with icicles. And when it did come, it was long, dark, and profoundly unromantic. At night, you'd sleep in a wooden structure with gaps in the walls, and your bed, if you had one, was stuffed with straw. Sometimes you'd wake up to find your water jug frozen solid. Sometimes your eyelashes would stick together from frost. And if you were poor, which let's be honest, most people were, you'd huddle with whoever or whatever was warm. Siblings, livestock, maybe a dog if you were lucky. The idea of personal space didn't exist. Neither did central heating, or insulation, or hope, really. Even kings and nobles weren't immune. Their castles had stone walls that turned into natural refrigerators in winter. Drafts would curl through the corridors like whispering ghosts, and the fire in the hearth? That did nothing if you weren't sitting directly in front of it. The farther you were from the flames, the more likely your teeth were to chatter audibly. There were tapestries hung not for decoration but for warmth. Beds had curtains, not for privacy but to trap body heat. And the food? Well, that depended on your planning. Grains, root vegetables, and anything pickled or salted. But if you'd had a bad harvest, or if your root cellar got raided by rats, you were in for a hungry winter. Bread turned hard enough to crack teeth. Beer turned to slush. Meat had to be smoked or salted so thoroughly you might as well be chewing on a log. Now imagine being sick, a fever in the middle of a snowstorm. No antibiotics, no real doctors, just prayers, herbal guesses, and maybe bloodletting if someone was feeling brave. You'd sweat under sheepskin and then freeze when the fever broke. Your breath would fog up in front of your face, even indoors, and if you coughed up blood, well, your neighbours might not come by again. Ever. But here's something quirky. Even in all that misery, people still found ways to make it feel like living. They held winter fairs, drank hot spiced wine, played music with whatever they had. Fiddles, bells, wooden flutes. Kids would skate on frozen ponds using bones strapped to their feet. Families told stories by firelight, some of them true, most of them absolutely wild. One of the earliest accounts of a truly catastrophic winter comes not from Europe, but from ancient China, back in the 6th century. The Book of Wei describes snow so deep that houses collapsed under the weight. People had to dig tunnels just to move between homes. That's not medieval Europe, sure, but it gives you a taste of how global this frosty chaos could be. Centuries before the famous Little Ice Age, the world already knew what it was like to freeze, and historians today still debate exactly what caused the more severe medieval winters. Some blame solar cycles, periods where the sun just chills out a bit, literally. Others point to volcanic eruptions like the massive mystery eruption in the 13th century that dropped global temperatures. But no one can quite agree. Was it climate? Was it God? Was it just bad luck and worse timing? And honestly, that's kind of the theme of medieval winter. A big, freezing shoulder shrug from the universe. Tonight we'll be diving deeper into some of the coldest, cruelest, most quietly horrifying winters of the medieval world. From famines and freezing rivers to volcanic winters and plague-chilled cities. Some of it will be funny, some of it will be bleak, and most of it will make you grateful for your central heating. So as the wind howls softly outside your window, or your fan hums like a far-off blizzard, you're going to travel with me through frostbitten fields, snow-choked castles, and icy riverbeds, where history stood still, literally. Because the rivers froze, like solid, you'll see. But don't worry, you're warm, you're safe, you've got blankets probably, and if not, maybe go grab one. It's going to be a long, cold night. You start to notice it in the bones first. That deep, throbbing ache that no fire seems to touch. You're not sick, it's just the cold working its way inside. Welcome to the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cold snap that Europe never quite saw coming. And neither did you. This wasn't a single bad winter. It was a series of them, stretching from roughly the 14th century to the mid-19th. Long enough for generations to live and die under grey skies, long enough for children to grow up thinking frozen rivers and crop failures were just the way of the world. What caused it? Well, you'd think we'd know for sure. But here's the fun part. Historians still argue about it. Some say it was the result of volcanic eruptions like Somala's or Kuwai, throwing so much ash into the sky it dimmed the sun. Others blame solar minimums, periods where sunspots vanish and the Earth gets just a little less sunshine. Then there are the ocean currents, shifting like moody serpents, pulling warmth away from Europe and locking the continent in a snowy grip. Or maybe all of the above. Climate doesn't like to make things simple. Whatever the cause, the effect was clear. Winters got colder, summers shorter and wetter, and entire communities had to rewrite the rules of survival. You live in a world where spring sometimes forgets to show up, and the harvest becomes a game of roulette. Sometimes you get barley, sometimes you get rot. The first wave hits hard. Around the early 1300s you can already feel the change. Crops begin to fail more often, the growing season shrinks, and the familiar rhythm of medieval life begins to unravel. The ground stays frozen longer than usual, and when the thaw comes it's muddy and half-hearted. Rain falls too much or not at all. It's like the weather's having a crisis of identity, and you're stuck dealing with the fallout. In villages, people start layering more. 2 tunics, extra woolen socks, anything to keep the chill out. You'd think nobles would do better, but even castles feel it. Fireplaces get bigger, wood piles higher, but still you can see your breath in the halls. Feather beds are piled with furs, but there's always a draught sneaking in from somewhere. And the rivers. Oh, the rivers. In a normal winter, the Thames might ice over a bit around the edges. But during the colder periods of the Little Ice Age, it doesn't just freeze. It becomes a solid sheet, thick enough for carts, horses, even festivals. Imagine walking down the middle of what should be a roaring current, past booths selling hot wine, roasted chestnuts and questionable meat pies. The frost fairs, they called them. They were part celebration, part survival mechanism. When life gives you frozen water, apparently, you throw a party on top of it. But this isn't just about London or the Thames. All across Europe, rivers behave like stubborn old men refusing to move. The Seine in Paris, the Rhine in Germany, even parts of the Danube, they all lock up, silent and eerie. And when rivers freeze, trade halts. Grain shipments don't arrive, markets go quiet. The economy ices over just as much as the landscape. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants do what they can. They stuff cracks in their homes with moss, hang animal skins over doors, and sleep in shifts so someone's always feeding the fire. Some even bring livestock indoors, not just for warmth, but because wolves are getting bolder, hungrier. Packs come closer to the villages now, their eyes reflecting torchlight, their howls rising like wind through broken shutters. You can hear it at night, the wind groaning through trees, the creak of snow-laden roofs, the distant snap of ice shifting on the river, and underneath it all the quiet dread. You know that if the cold lasts too long, if the food doesn't stretch, someone won't make it to spring. This is where things get strangely poetic. The cold doesn't just shape the land, it shapes belief. People start to think the chill is punishment, a divine reminder. maybe for sins, maybe for pride, maybe just for being human. Monks record the weather like omens. Chroniclers describe years without summer and skies without warmth. In sermons, winter becomes a metaphor for judgment, and when the snow falls especially heavy, some say it's a cleansing, white and pure even as it smothers villages whole. And here's your quirky fact of the night. In 1674, during one especially brutal season, Parisian bakers had to bake bread using hot stones to thaw their frozen flour. People would line up not just for food, but for the warmth of the bakery itself. And if you were smart and desperate, you'd hang around, hoping the baker might drop something. There's also the weird scholarly tidbit. Some researchers think that cold winters helped shape Renaissance art. Hear me out. With longer, darker winters, more people were indoors, spending time on writing, painting, and music. And some of those paintings, they start showing snow-covered landscapes for the first time in Western art history. Winter becomes not just a season, but a mood, a canvas. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some argue that those paintings are exaggerated or symbolic, not literal. Maybe the artist just liked snow, or maybe they were trying to make a point about hardship and faith. Either way, the cold creeps into culture just as much as it creeps into homes. And the worst part, there's no weather report, no warning. You wake up one day and realise the frost has come early, or stayed too long, and you don't know when, or if, it will end. That uncertainty is the real weight of the Little Ice Age, the waiting, the guessing, the praying that next year will be better. So you light another candle, wrap another scarf, stir the soup even if it's just hot water and turnip peelings. And outside, the snow keeps falling, soft and slow and endless. It starts with rain, not snow, not sleet, just plain, persistent rain, cold, miserable, and relentless. It's the spring of 1315, and you've barely pulled through a long, hungry winter when the skies decide they're not done with you yet. April comes, and the rain begins. May follows, and it's still coming down. By June, your field is a swamp. By July, your wheat is drowning. August, don't even ask. The sun's gone missing. People start joking that it's been kidnapped. Others aren't laughing. This is no ordinary bad season. This is the beginning of something Europe hasn't seen in centuries. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. And yes, you're going to live through it, but you're not going to like it. Let's be clear. Medieval Europe lives and dies by its harvests. You can't Amazon your food. You can't even rely on imports most of the time. Whatever you grow, you eat. Whatever you don't grow, you probably don't eat. So when the rain keeps falling, day after day, week after week, people start doing mental math that ends with somebody not getting dinner. You live in a little village somewhere in northern France, or maybe the Low Countries. Not that it matters. This famine doesn't care about borders. The rain flattens everything. The sky stays a dull leaden grey, like it's sulking. Crops rot in the fields. Livestock mired in the mud begin to fall ill. You try to salvage what you can, harvest early, dry grains over smoky fires, but it's not enough. Then comes the cold. Not the icy slap of January, but the damp chill of a sunless summer. You're wet, you're tired, you're starting to think about things you wouldn't normally consider eating. By late 1315, people are starving. Real starvation. Not missed lunch, hungry. More like, your body is slowly eating itself, hungry. You begin to see strange things in the village. A child gnawing on bark. A man selling what's clearly dog meat but calling it forest hare. Rumours swirl of worse. People eating moss, people eating rats, people eating each other. There are court records, still preserved oddly enough, of people being executed for cannibalism during this time. In one case, a man reportedly dug up fresh graves for food. Another was caught butchering a child. It's horrifying, but also chillingly logical. Starvation bends the brain. In a world without food banks or emergency aid, you do what you have to, or what your body forces you to. But not everyone is doomed. Monasteries, with their stored grain and brewing knowledge, fare slightly better. Nobles too, if they manage their estates wisely, can survive the worst of it. But even the upper crust feels the pressure. Grain prices spike so high that bread becomes a luxury. Some lords sell off land or jewels just to keep their kitchens stocked. Others tighten their fists, hoarding supplies and letting villagers starve. So yes, the famine hits everyone, but like most things, it hits the poor hardest. And in the midst of it all, religion begins to shift. Some priests blame sin, of course, they always do. Others blame the Jews, or the lepers, or witches. Everyone's looking for a scapegoat, because it's easier to burn someone than accept that the rain just won't stop. You get up one morning in the fall of 1316 and the fields are still soaked. The grain is black with mould. The few animals you had are gone, either dead, traded, or stolen. You're eating boiled weeds and pretending it's stew. And maybe, just maybe, you catch yourself wishing for a good old-fashioned snowy winter. Something cold, yes, but dry. Anything but this soggy misery. Here's a strange little footnote for you. Some historians think this famine changed the population more than the Black Death. Not in body count, though it was high, but in attitude. People who lived through these years came out different. Harder, hungrier. They didn't trust the land anymore. They certainly didn't trust the sky. And while we're here, let's toss in a debate. Did this famine directly contribute to the Black Death later on? Some scholars think so. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. Populations that scrape through a famine are more vulnerable to future plagues. Others argue it's coincidence that the two disasters are decades apart and come from different causes. Still, when you string these events together, famine, plague, war, it starts to look like nature had it out for medieval Europe. You'd think the worst of it would break people, and it does, some, but others adapt. They start new farming techniques, switch crops, build better drainage. The famine forces change. Painful as it is, it teaches a bitter lesson. Don't trust the sun. Don't expect mercy from the sky. Always store more than you think you'll need. By 1318, the rains finally ease. The fields dry. Wheat grows again, tentatively. But it's a hollow victory. You've lost friends, maybe family. Whole villages have disappeared, either abandoned or buried. And the trauma lingers like smoke. Even now, decades later, you flinch when the rain begins to fall in spring. You check the sky too often. You don't smile at the clouds. Still, life continues, people rebuild, babies are born, songs are sung. But something has shifted. There's a line in your memory now, dividing the time before the rains and the time after. And even when the sun returns, it doesn't feel quite warm enough. You wake to silence, not the comforting kind, but the eerie hush of a world paused mid-breath. Outside your window, if you even have a window and not just a cloth-covered hole, the world is white. Not with snowflakes drifting down all fluffy and gentle, but with hard frost, crusted thick like armour over every rooftop, branch and cobblestone. You step outside and the air stings your nose like needles. The River Thames has frozen solid, and all of London feels like it's been trapped in a snow globe someone forgot to shake. It's the 17th century now, and while the chill has been a regular visitor for generations, this winter is on another level. The city is buzzing, not with fear, surprisingly, but with excitement. You shuffle with the crowd toward the river, following the scent of smoke and meat, the sound of bells and shouting vendors. There's a frost fair underway. Yes, Londoners have decided that if the world's going to freeze, they might as well throw a party on top of it. Stalls are set up directly on the ice, barbers offering shaves beside fishmongers frying eels. There's a printing press out here, churning out novelty pamphlets that read, "Printed on the frozen Thames," just in case future generations don't believe it. Jugglers toss flaming torches, children chase each other, slipping and screaming, and somewhere a bear is dancing. Probably not voluntarily. You pick your way across the frozen river, half marvelling, half terrified. You've heard stories of the ice cracking open beneath people's feet, swallowing them whole, never to be seen again. But today, it holds. Thick enough for horses, carts, entire stages. It's beautiful and bizarre, a kind of icy defiance against the hardship of the season. But let's not get too cosy, because while the surface sparkles with laughter and mulled wine, the freeze has consequences. Trade, for one, is a disaster. The Thames isn't just a pretty river, it's a major transport route. When it freezes, goods can't move. Ships get stuck or have to dock miles away and food prices spike. Coal deliveries slow down, wood shortages worsen. So while the party's raging above, households are running out of fuel and fires burn lower every night. And the coal doesn't stop at London. Across Europe, rivers freeze that never should. The Seine, the Rhine. Even Venice sees its canals turn to slush. In Scandinavia, the Baltic Sea locks up like a solid plane of glass. Armies march across it. Horses gallop where ships once sailed. It's awe-inspiring and deeply wrong. There's one winter, the freeze of 1683 to 1684, that earns legendary status. The Thames is frozen for 2 whole months. Birds drop dead mid-flight. Ink freezes in inkwells. Trees split open with loud cracks as the sap inside them turns to ice. It's that cold. People huddle closer than ever, in cottages, tenements and manor houses alike. The city's breath fogs the skyline. But here's your quirky fact of the night. In this frozen winter, someone decides to roast an ox on the Thames. Like, a whole ox. They carve it up and sell the meat to delighted customers who probably forgot how thin their blankets were for just a moment. Another man sets up a bowling lane on the ice, and there's at least one record of a couple getting married on the river, complete with clergy, guests, and a frozen cake, probably. So, is this normal? Not even remotely. The scholarly debate kicks in here. Some argue these deep freezes were anomalies, rare cold snaps amplified by a Maunder minimum, a time when sunspots practically vanished, and the Earth saw cooler temps as a result. Others think it's a combination of that and volcanic activity, massive eruptions spewing ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, nudging things toward colder extremes. Either way, these frosts aren't just local quirks, they're continental events, and for London the frozen Thames becomes a symbol of resilience maybe, or of stubborn British cheer. The fairs continue sporadically for centuries, but they become rarer as the climate shifts again. By the early 1800s, the river's been reshaped by embankments and bridges. The currents run faster, and it no longer freezes over. The last true frost fair is held in 1814. After that, the river stays liquid, even in the worst winters. But for now, in the thick of the cold, you sip something warm from a cracked mug and try not to think about your toes. They've gone numb. That could mean warmth is coming, or that it's time to worry. As night falls, the lights on the river flicker. Candles sway in the wind. Musicians pack up their instruments, breath puffing like smoke. Somewhere, a child cries. Somewhere else, a drunk sings. And all around you, the ice stretches silent and glittering beneath the dark. You start to head home, boots slipping, joints aching. You'll sleep in your cloak tonight, maybe with a dog, definitely under every blanket you own. Because outside, it's not just cold, it's history. And it's not done with you yet. The snow here doesn't fall gently. It comes sideways, whipped by Arctic winds that scream across the ice like angry ghosts. You can barely see 10 feet in front of you, but that doesn't matter. There's not much to look at anymore. Just whiteness, blank, unbroken, and absolute. You're in Greenland now, or rather, the part of Greenland that used to be home to Viking settlers, Norsemen who once farmed these frozen shores, herded sheep, and sent ivory to Europe. Now, their farms are buried, their churches silent, their bones scattered beneath permafrost. The Norse colonies here didn't just disappear, they froze to death. At least that's one version of the story. It begins optimistically, believe it or not. Around the late 10th century, Norse explorer Eric the Red, freshly exiled from Iceland for a bit too much murder, sails west and finds this enormous ice-covered island. He names it Greenland, a marketing scam really, hoping to entice other settlers with the promise of arable land. And it kind of works, for a time. By the 12th century, there are 2 major Norse settlements here, the eastern and western settlements. Not cities, but clusters of turf homes, wooden churches, barns and sheep pens. Rough, remote, but functional. The Norse in Greenland were survivors. They farmed grasslands during a period called the medieval warm period, a brief interlude of relative warmth that let things grow where, frankly, they shouldn't have. They built stone churches, raised cattle, and even traded with Europe. Life was harsh, sure, but manageable, until it wasn't. By the late 13th century, the warmth fades. The Little Ice Age creeps in, not like a blizzard, but like a long, slow exhale of frost. Summers become shorter, grasslands fail, icebergs multiply in the North Atlantic, making trade routes harder and more dangerous. The winters grow longer, darker, and colder. And then the western settlement goes quiet. There are no records, no dramatic battles, no mass graves. Just silence. When later expeditions arrive, they find ruins, abandoned farms, roofless churches, cattle pens filled with snow. It's like the settlers simply walked away, except there's nowhere to go. The sea is treacherous. The inland is harsher. Most likely they stayed and died. The eastern settlement holds on a bit longer. There are records of marriages, baptisms, and even complaints about taxes well into the 1400s. But by the mid-15th century, it too vanishes from the record. Letters from bishops go unanswered. Trading ships find no one at the docks. A 1540 Danish expedition reports only Inuit living there, and no trace of the Norse. So what happened? Well, here's your scholarly debate of the night. Some say climate is the main villain, that as the cold deepened, crops failed, livestock starved, and isolation worsened. Others argue that cultural rigidity played a role. The Norse, it's said, refused to adapt to Inuit survival techniques. They didn't fish enough. They didn't hunt seals or dress in furs like the locals. They stuck to their European farming traditions even as the soil betrayed them and the sea iced over. And then there's the theory of resource exhaustion. Too many people, not enough trees or topsoil. The land degraded under pressure, and the colony collapsed like a tired lung. Your quirky fact: archaeologists have found the bones of Greenland Norse buried in traditional Christian graves with no signs of trauma, but showing clear evidence of malnutrition. Brittle ribs, worn-down joints, teeth marked by hunger. These weren't violent deaths. These were slow, quiet, cold. Back in your hypothetical fur-lined boots, you stand in the doorway of a ruined longhouse. The snow has drifted so high, it nearly buries the windows. The roof is gone, long collapsed under centuries of wind and weight. You can still see the stone outlines of the building, the hearth blackened with old smoke. It smells faintly of ice and lichen and salt air. Maybe once this room echoed with laughter or the lowing of animals. Now there's only silence, broken by the wind hammering over the fjords. The truth is, medieval Greenland was a promise built on temporary weather. The Norse built farms where tundra had briefly thawed, mistaking an anomaly for permanence. When the planet slipped back into its natural chill, those farms became traps. Their world froze from the edges inward. You run your hand along the crumbling stone of a church wall. It's smooth from centuries of wind and blown snow. Imagine huddling here, not just for prayer, but for shelter. Imagine the sermons during those last years. Hold fast. God will provide. Spring will come. And maybe it never did. There's something beautifully grim about the Greenland colonies. A civilization that wasn't destroyed by war or conquest, but simply outlasted by winter. No screaming battles, no flaming cities, just snow and ice and time. And what happened to the last Greenlander? Did they die alone? Did they leave a message? Did they climb a ridge and stare out at the white horizon, knowing no ship would come? No one knows. That's the part that sticks with you as you walk back toward your own imagined shelter. You're warm, of course. Your blankets are thick, your tea is hot, your heater hums quietly. But out there, somewhere beneath the ice, are the ghosts of farmers who gambled on green and lost to white. You're walking through a village now, somewhere in Central Europe, and there's a strange sort of quiet hovering in the air. Not peaceful quiet. More like the uneasy silence of people who are trying very hard not to think about how bad things have gotten. The harvest failed. Again. The winters come early, pressing down on the thatched roofs like a warning, and somewhere, not too far off, someone just accused their neighbour of being a witch. Because that's what happens when the temperature drops, and the livestock start dying, and the children are coughing up blood. People look for answers, and if they can't find them in the skies, they start looking closer to home. Maybe too close. Welcome to the darker side of medieval winter, where superstition runs hot while everything else freezes over. You don't need a meteorologist to tell you things are weird. Snow is falling in places where it shouldn't. Frost comes earlier each year. The apple trees bloom too late, or not at all. Rivers stay frozen long past Lent, and even the bees seem confused. For the past few decades, winters have been growing more unpredictable, more vicious. And when nature breaks its promises, the mind goes hunting for something, or someone, to blame. Enter the witch hunts. Contrary to popular belief, the major witch-hunting frenzies didn't happen in the so-called Dark Ages. They actually peaked in the late medieval and early modern period, especially in places like Germany, Switzerland and France. And scholars still argue about why. Some say it was religion. Protestants and Catholics battling not just for theological supremacy, but for moral clarity. Others blame politics or social unrest. or simply the printing press churning out manuals like Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous hammer of witches. But one of the most compelling theories? Climate anxiety. As the Little Ice Age ramped up, crops failed more frequently, famine swept across the continent, and disease followed right behind. The weather felt off, unnatural. And in a world without science to explain jet streams or sunspots, the only logical conclusion was that someone, something, was tampering with the natural order, and that someone 9 times out of 10 was a woman living on the edge of town with a few herbs in her garden. You're standing in a packed wooden hall watching a trial unfold. A woman in her 50s is trembling before a local magistrate. The villagers whisper around you. She spoiled the milk, they say. She cursed the baker's child. She walks barefoot in the snow without shivering, and her chickens lay eggs out of season. The air smells like sweat, firewood, and something sour. The judge isn't interested in her defence. He's more interested in the stories, the coincidences, the weather. And when the snow falls again that week, heavy and silent like a judgment from above, well, that's all the proof they need. You try not to think about how many others have already been burned or drowned or tested in rivers. If they float, they're guilty. If they sink, they're innocent, and also dead. It's a lose-lose situation, expertly designed for public fear and private revenge. It sounds unthinkable now, but back then, it made emotional sense. People didn't have the luxury of doubt. When winter takes your food and your child and maybe your last pig, you want an answer, something tangible. You can't punch a blizzard, but you can throw someone into a fire and hope the weather improves. And maybe, just maybe, sometimes it did. Coincidence, of course, but people love patterns. One warm spring after an execution is all it takes to turn suspicion into certainty. Here's your quirky fact for the night. During one of the harshest winters in Swiss history, a town executed more than 60 people over the course of a single season, blaming their local climate crisis on witches. That's not a town, that's a panic machine. And what's really interesting, if you can call it that, is that the witch trials often spike during extreme cold periods. In fact, some historians have charted the overlap between climate data and execution records, and the correlation is disturbingly consistent. The worse the winter, the higher the flames. Still, not everyone bought into the hysteria. There were skeptics even then. Some theologians argued that blaming women for the weather was not only ridiculous, but deeply unchristian. Others pointed out the political convenience of it all. Land and property often ended up in the hands of accusers or the church. Fancy that. And there's a scholarly debate we should touch on here. Did the climate actually cause the witch hunts, or just contribute to an already simmering paranoia? Some academics say the connection is overblown, that social and religious shifts mattered more. Others argue that without the cold, without the repeated ecological stress, those same societies wouldn't have been desperate enough to turn on their own. Whatever the answer, you walk through that village with a heavy heart. The snow crunches underfoot. Smoke curls from chimneys like sighs. And everywhere, you see people watching each other too closely. A girl who won't stop sneezing. A man with mismatched eyes. A goat that gave birth too early. Every winter now is a test, not just of endurance, but of belief. Can you explain the storm? Can you name the cause of the freeze? Because if not, someone else will, and it might involve torches. As night falls, you settle into a cramped room surrounded by your family. You say your prayers, not just for warmth and survival, but that no one looks at you too long if the roof leaks or the cow dies. Outside, the wind moans like a warning. You pull the blankets up to your chin and close your eyes, pretending not to hear the church bell toll for another lost soul. You wouldn't expect snow in Baghdad. Not now, and certainly not 1,000 years ago. But here we are, January 1007, and white flakes are falling from the sky, soft and silent, blanketing the city that was once the glittering jewel of the Islamic Golden Age. People come out of their houses in stunned confusion, staring upward as if the heavens have gotten something terribly wrong. Children try to catch the flakes on their tongues. Old men whisper that it's an omen. Women huddle closer to their braziers, not quite sure whether to be afraid or amazed. Because snow in medieval Baghdad, that's like palm trees in Iceland. It just doesn't happen until it does. You're standing in the heart of this ancient city, surrounded by domed roofs and narrow alleys, the air filled with the scent of cardamom, firewood, and now, strangely, snow. The Tigris River runs sluggish and grey nearby, and even it seems confused by the sudden chill. You wrap your wool cloak tighter and watch the snow accumulate on mosque minarets, the same structures that once watched over scholars, poets, and physicians as they mapped the stars and dissected the body's secrets. The world is colder than it should be. Climate anomalies like this didn't just hit Europe. The Little Ice Age, or whatever flavour of global cooling was bubbling beneath the surface in the medieval period, had reach. From East Asia to the Middle East to North Africa, weird weather was afoot. Famines struck Persia. Droughts crept into India. In Japan, records describe rice crops dying in summer hailstorms. And then there's Baghdad, staring up at snow like it's a glitch in the simulation. The thing is, medieval Islamic scholars noticed, this wasn't some backwater kingdom shrugging at the sky. Baghdad was one of the intellectual capitals of the world, home to the House of Wisdom, a legendary library and research centre that brought together minds from across the known world. Astronomers tracked planetary movements. Mathematicians refined algebra. Doctors dissected corpses and categorised diseases. So when it snowed, they didn't just marvel, they documented. One 11th century scholar, Ibn al-Jawzi, wrote that the snow came down in thick flurries, blanketed the city and lingered for days. He called it strange beyond measure. People gathered in the mosques to pray, unsure if this was a blessing or a curse. Others lit fires in clay bowls and tried not to think about what snow meant for the next harvest. Here's your quirky fact. Some sources suggest that in places like Cairo, snow was once so rare that people believed it to be solidified rain sent by jinn, supernatural spirits from Islamic folklore. One local legend claimed that when it snowed, the earth was being cooled to allow the gates of heaven to open more easily. Charming. Also, completely impractical when your olive trees are freezing. Now let's touch on the scholarly debate. Was this truly a global climate anomaly, or just a patchwork of regional disruptions we're stitching together with hindsight bias? Some researchers argue that the so-called Little Ice Age wasn't a single global event, but a series of overlapping cold periods that struck different areas at different times and intensities. Others point to ice core samples and tree rings that seem to agree. Yes, something colder than usual was happening across much of the globe, even if it wasn't a tidy, synchronized event. Still, if you're living through it, you don't care about terminology. You just know that your fig trees are dying, your irrigation canals are crusted with frost, the sheep are shivering, and the dates have gone soft and sour. You stop trusting the seasons. Spring doesn't come when it should. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. Imagine being a merchant trying to move spices or silks across a suddenly frigid desert. Camels struggling through snowdrifts. Sand turned to mud. The economic networks of the Islamic world, so dependent on timing, weather and reliability, start to fray at the edges. Trade slows. Food becomes expensive. Unrest simmers beneath the surface. And of course, there's always that familiar medieval reflex. Blame the sky. Some say the snow is divine punishment. Others whisper about star alignments. A few quietly point fingers at outsiders, foreigners, heretics, anyone conveniently not standing nearby to defend themselves. As you walk through the marketplace, which should be bustling but now sits half-shuttered under a low grey sky, you can feel the tension. Vendors warm their hands over coals. A beggar crouches near the mosque steps, wrapped in burlap, his beard frosted white. Above him, a call to prayer echoes faintly, thin and cold and beautiful. And then you feel it, that crunch, that sharp crackle underfoot. Snow again. You look down and see a thin new layer forming, undeterred by the faint winter sun. The city's roofs have begun to sag. Birds have disappeared. The wind bites harder. Maybe this is just one freak storm. Or maybe it's the beginning of a shift no one's ready for. And that's the scary part, isn't it? You can plan for invaders. You can build walls against thieves. But what do you do when the sky decides to change the rules? As night falls over Baghdad, the snow keeps falling. Quiet, slow, methodical. You curl up near a brazier, rubbing your hands together, listening to the city hold its breath. Somewhere nearby, someone is writing it all down on parchment. An odd entry in a long record. A day when the sky forgot its place. A warning, maybe. Or just a fluke. But either way, the world isn't as stable as it seemed. The snowflakes fall like tiny frozen footnotes in the margin of history. You can smell it before you see it. The thick, sour scent of something not quite clean, not quite human. The kind of smell that clings to the air, sticks in your throat and doesn't wash off. You're in a medieval town. Could be Florence, could be London, could be somewhere nameless in between. And it's the winter of 1348. Everything is cold, wet, and somehow still crawling with sickness. The cobblestones are slick with melted snow and something darker. The plague has arrived, and it is absolutely thriving in this grim, frozen paradise. The Black Death doesn't knock. It doesn't give you time to prepare. One moment, you're sharing bread with your neighbour. The next, he's coughing blood and covered in boils the size of goose eggs. And in this particular winter, the chill hasn't slowed it down. If anything, it's helped it spread. Let's pause here for a second, because there's an ongoing scholarly debate about climate's role in the spread of plague, and honestly, the answers are as murky as a 14th century soup pot. Some historians argue that colder temperatures during the early phases of the Little Ice Age helped the plague along by creating the perfect storm of famine, weakened immune systems, and population shifts. Others suggest the cold actually slowed down the fleas that carried the disease. But no matter where you fall on the theory spectrum, one thing is certain. The winter of 1348 is one of the grimmest in recorded memory. Not because of the snow, but because of the silence it leaves behind. You're moving through a half-deserted market square. Stalls stand empty, some still draped with linens fluttering in the cold wind. A dog scurries past, ribs sharp against its fur. Somewhere a bell tolls, not for a sermon, not for a feast day, for a burial, again and again. You pass a cart filled with bodies, hastily covered in straw. The driver doesn't even glance at you. His eyes are swollen from smoke and grief. You'd think the cold might kill the disease. That's what people are whispering. The frost will cleanse us, they say. The snow will slow it down. But it doesn't. It just preserves the corpses. In some places the ground is too frozen to dig graves, so the dead pile up. Monks pray over them quickly, noses stuffed with herbs, then move on. The air is sharp with the scent of pine, rotting meat, and something worse. Fear. That sour, unmistakable reek of despair. You find shelter in a tavern, but it's no warmer inside. The fire burns low, the ale is thin, and every person around you looks like they've aged 10 years in a week. A woman clutches a rosary so tightly the beads have left marks in her palms. A man drinks with both hands like the cup might escape him. No one speaks unless they have to. Even the laughter, when it comes, is strained. Too loud, too sharp, like people trying to prove they're still alive. Here's your quirky fact for the night. During one especially brutal winter, some cities paid people, usually the poor, the desperate, or the drunk, to serve as corpse collectors, dragging the dead through the snow to hastily dug trenches. These plague workers often wore waxed coats, masks stuffed with herbs, and gloves. It was an early accidental form of PPE. It didn't always work. And here's the creepy twist. The frozen ground kept some bodies so intact that, come spring, when the earth finally thawed, families tried to reclaim and rebury them. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they found that animals had gotten there first. Either way, spring didn't bring relief. It brought rot. The scholarly debate here gets a little weirder. Some believe that winter migration patterns of rodents played a bigger role than weather itself. As the cold drove rats and mice indoors, they brought their fleas with them. And suddenly, you're sharing your bread not just with your children, but with tiny hitchhikers that carry a microscopic horror. Others argue that the cooling climate had disrupted the old rural economy, forcing more people into cities, denser, dirtier places where disease spread like wildfire. You step outside again and notice the snow falling, soft and soundless. It looks beautiful, clean even, but you know better now. You've seen the plague pustules, the blackened fingertips, the way someone can be laughing over stew one evening and dead by morning. This snow isn't mercy, it's a shroud. And as you walk through the silent streets, you see signs hung over doors, crude red crosses, warnings written in charcoal, messages like "Lord save us" or "Do not enter." Infected. Some homes are simply boarded shut, no one inside to post a message, no one left. Still, not everyone succumbs. That's the strange part. Some people survive. Maybe they're lucky. Maybe they've already had it and didn't know. Or maybe their cottage sits just a little too far from the next one, and the wind kept the wrong visitor away. Superstition kicks in again. Some say eating garlic wards it off. Others say bathing is dangerous and opens your pores to the disease. A few believe cats are to blame. Others believe cats are protection. You'd be amazed how fast people can change their minds when death knocks twice in the same household. Night comes early in winter, and the darkness feels heavier than usual. You curl into a borrowed blanket in a quiet chapel, the stone cold against your back. Outside, the snow still falls. Inside, you can hear someone coughing. Not a gentle cough, a deep, rattling, lung-loosening kind of cough. You don't move, you barely breathe, because tomorrow it might be your turn to feel the fever, or worse, nothing at all. The wind howls softly against the walls. You wonder how many are left, how long the winter will last, and whether spring will bring life, or just a softer ground for the dead. You're standing on ice thick enough to hold a horse. Think about that for a second. A full-grown, shivering, hay-fed medieval horse. Not just standing, but walking, trotting, maybe even being ridden by some half-drunk noble in fur-lined boots who's decided this is the perfect moment for a joust. Welcome to the Frost Fairs. Those bizarre, short-lived winter festivals where people didn't just endure the freeze, they capitalised on it. The River Thames is frozen again, wide and white and solid as marble. But this time, it's not just passable. It's become a pop-up wonderland. Stalls, stages, games, and yes, questionable meat pies. You weave through the crowd wrapped in layers of wool, fur, and whatever else you could find in your grandmother's chest. Your breath fogs the air in front of you. Your boots crunch with each step. You could be miserable, but somehow you're not. Because there's something delightfully absurd about watching Londoners set up bowling alleys on a river. A printer hawks freshly inked pamphlets with titles like A Strange and Wonderful Sight Upon the Frozen Thames. Children skid around on bone skates, screeching with laughter, while jugglers toss flaming batons dangerously close to everyone's heads. Someone's selling roasted chestnuts. Someone else is roasting a whole pig. And yes, in one particularly unhinged moment of culinary bravado, you see a man trying to deep fry an eel over a brazier perched on ice. You should be cold. You are cold. But there's joy here too, a defiant kind of joy, because if the world insists on freezing, people are going to make it entertaining. The Frost Fairs pop up every time the Thames freezes hard enough, which isn't every year, but often enough between the 1600s and early 1800s to become a part of collective memory. You've probably heard about the one in 1683 to 1684, the coldest winter anyone can remember. The ice stretches for 2 miles, people pitch tents, poets write verses, a whole ox is roasted, and yes, you buy a slice even though it's expensive and you're not entirely sure it's cooked through. You eat it anyway, because when else are you going to say, I ate ice-roasted beef on a frozen river? But not everyone is laughing. Beneath the revelry is the quiet anxiety of disruption. Ships can't move, markets are delayed, prices rise, bakers run out of flour and fuel is rationed. A few too many people fall through weak spots in the ice each year, usually near the edges where the current still stirs beneath the surface. Some survive, some don't. The fair goes on either way, and not everyone has time for games. The poor suffer more, as always. If you can't afford firewood, your nights are long and dangerous. Some Londoners burn furniture or tear apart fences just to keep the hearth lit. You hear stories of families burning books, heirlooms, Bibles, records, just to keep a child's hands from going blue. It's a cheerful-looking scene out here on the ice, but back in the alleyways and tenements, the cold bites deeper. Still, the fairs go on. They serve a purpose beyond distraction. They are, in a strange way, protest. A kind of carnival flipped upside down. You can't stop the freeze, but you can laugh in its face, eat meat off a snow-dusted table, and pay to have your fortune told by a man in a fake beard who calls himself the Frost Seer. You visit him, of course. He tells you spring is coming. You pay him anyway, knowing full well he says that to everyone. Here's your quirky fact for the night. In 1716, one of the Frost Fairs featured a mini zoo. A caged monkey danced to the sound of fiddles. Children threw snowballs at a taxidermied bear posed upright in a wooden booth. One vendor sold frost ale, a terrible-sounding beer brewed to be consumed warm, made with ginger and cloves and, allegedly, river water. You decline. Even history has its limits. There's a scholarly debate that still pops up about these fairs. Were they signs of resilience or desperation? Some argue they were economic necessities, a way for workers and vendors to scrape together income during a paralysed winter. Others think they were pure spectacle, the medieval version of a pop-up theme park. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle, a frozen mix of both. But eventually even this celebration has to end. The thaw begins, slowly at first. You step onto the ice one day and feel a subtle vibration beneath your feet. The stalls start closing. The printers fold up their presses. The jugglers vanish. People mutter about warm breezes and shifting ice. You hurry home, boots soaked through, as cracks appear on the river's surface like lightning trapped beneath glass. By nightfall, the sound of the ice breaking echoes through the city. Low groans, sudden pops, like cannon fire from below. Someone's tent has been swallowed whole. A cart's wheel disappears into a widening hole. The fair is gone by morning. All that remains are damp footprints on the riverbank and a few soggy pamphlets fluttering in the mud. You sit in your room, wrapped in every blanket you own, sipping something warm, trying to hold on to the memory. It was beautiful in its way, surreal, fleeting, the kind of joy only found in the cracks between suffering and survival. And tomorrow? Back to scraping the frost off your boots and hoping the rats haven't chewed through the grain sack. But for one strange moment, the ice gave you a world of wonder, and for that you almost forgive it. You wake to the faint sound of hooves striking ice, not the gentle clip of horses on cobblestone, but a deep, hollow crunch that makes you pause mid-step. Somewhere not far off, an entire army is attempting to cross a frozen Baltic Sea, and you can feel the tension in the air like static. It's winter in northern Europe, and the ice is thick, deceptive, and extremely tempting for generals who think marching across a frozen sea is a brilliant idea. History tells us otherwise. The Baltic freezes more reliably than most rivers, at least during the peak of the Little Ice Age, and when it does, it becomes a temporary superhighway for armies. Knights in armour, infantry and carts laden with supplies take advantage of the frozen expanse. You can almost imagine the strategy session. Sir, the ice is treacherous. Nonsense. Frost will hold. Onward. And they do, until it doesn't. You're standing on the edge of this human experiment, shivering in boots soaked from the snowmelt. The frozen sea stretches into a grey horizon, wind whipping over its surface, carrying the tang of salt and frozen fish. You see banners snapping, men adjusting their fur-lined cloaks, officers shouting over the roar of the wind. Everything glimmers like glass, cold and cruel. There's beauty here, yes, but it's the kind that makes your teeth ache. And then there's the unexpected danger. Ice is not uniform, patches are thin, currents run beneath. One misstep, or one overloaded cart, and someone plunges into the frigid water below. The Baltic does not forgive. It swallows boots, horses, and sometimes entire units. The rest of the army pushes onward, fearful but determined, because retreat is politically impossible, and winter doesn't wait. Famine and logistics complicate things further. These soldiers aren't just fighting the enemy, they're fighting hunger and frostbite. Meat rations are frozen solid, grain sacks burst open in the cold, and water turns to ice before it even hits the canteens. Knights swear under their helmets, cooks curse in the mess tents, and all around the icy wind whispers threats through the rigging of supply sleds and makeshift bridges of timber. Here's a quirky footnote. In 1658, during the Swedish invasion of Denmark, King Charles X of Sweden actually marched his army across the frozen Danish straits. Some soldiers walked over the ice, others rode horses. Legend has it that some of the ice cracked beneath the cavalry, creating a spectacle of splashing horses and screaming men. Miraculously, most survived. History calls it genius. Your toes would call it masochism. And yet, armies kept trying it. Why? Because during extreme winters, frozen seas temporarily rewrite geography. Islands connect. Fortresses become accessible from places they normally aren't. Surprise attacks are possible. The landscape itself becomes a weapon, and commanders, brave or foolish, take advantage. Scholars debate whether it's bravery, stupidity, or just necessity. Some argue it shows strategic genius. Others see sheer recklessness. From your vantage point, you notice smaller, quieter effects of the frozen Baltic too. Villagers along the coast can suddenly walk to previously unreachable islands. Fishermen risk crossing cracks for easier catches. Carts haul timber across ice that normally would require weeks of hauling by sea. Life adapts in strange ways when the winter is this unforgiving, but the cold has a price. Frostbite claims fingers and toes, hypothermia creeps into soldiers' chests, and morale is fragile. One wrong order, one misjudged patch of ice, and lives vanish beneath the grey, brittle surface. You can almost hear the whispers of those who never returned, the crunch of boots, the snap of ice, the silent final plunge. As evening falls, the sun barely clears the horizon. Shadows stretch long over the frozen expanse, turning the ice into a sheet of pale silver. You huddle in your cloak, listening to the groan of the army and the distant snap of breaking ice. It's magnificent, terrifying, and utterly medieval. Because winter, as always, decides the rules, and humans, clever, bold, foolish, simply try to survive. By nightfall, the army has pushed forward, leaving behind footprints that will vanish in the next snowfall. You curl into your shelter, imagining the frozen Baltic stretching endlessly, knowing that tomorrow someone else will test the ice. It's a dangerous dance with nature, one that leaves everyone humbled, even the knights in shining armour. You're crouched behind a thick wooden wall, snow piling against the stones like a silent tide. Outside, the air smells of damp hay, smoke, and something faintly metallic. Horses stamp impatiently in their stalls, clouds of mist rising from their flanks. The siege has lasted weeks, maybe months, and food is running out faster than hope. You can hear the crunch of boots on frozen ground as soldiers patrol the perimeter, weapons clinking in rhythm with their anxious hearts. Winter has turned this castle into a prison for both the besieged and the besiegers, a world where hunger gnaws as surely as frost. It's not just the cold that kills here, it's the combination. The frozen ground making digging nearly impossible, the lack of fresh meat, the thin broth stretched across too many mouths. You're scavenging root vegetables buried in snow and peeling bark from trees to add to stews. Every morsel counts, every meal is a calculation, and still it's never enough. You catch yourself staring at a horse's flank with a little too much attention, your stomach growling as if it has its own voice. Medieval siege cuisine is brutal, especially in winter. The walls, normally a symbol of safety, now feel like a trap. Snow and ice block access to wells, making water scarce. The motor's frozen, but that's no help. The ice is thin, treacherous. You know that one misstep could plunge someone into a frigid death. The defenders of the castle have adapted, hauling firewood and straw wherever possible, but even the cleverest plans falter in sustained cold. Hypothermia licks at fingers and toes, uninvited and relentless. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. During some medieval sieges, defenders used heated sandbags to protect themselves from freezing, shoving them into drafty corners or wrapping them around limbs. Imagine the smell: smoke, sand, and desperate warmth. It's ingenious, yes, but it's also a reminder that survival often involves small, temporary tricks rather than grand strategies. Meanwhile, morale is fragile. Starvation makes tempers sharp. Arguments break out over the last scrap of bread. Soldiers steal, peasants whisper, and even knights, the supposed paragons of courage, slink in fear. Historians debate the psychological impact of winter during sieges, and rightly so. Some argue the cold alone could break an army more effectively than any assault. Others say it simply exposed the weaknesses already present in leadership and logistics. Either way, the cold is a ruthless commander. Outside, the attacking force faces similar struggles. Their tents are battered by wind. Their horses are weary. Food convoys are delayed by ice and snow. One miscalculation, and they risk starvation before even breaching the walls. Winter doesn't discriminate. Everyone suffers. Everyone adapts or dies. It's a test of patience as much as of skill. You notice, too, the ingenuity born of necessity. Smoke from the hearth is channeled into tunnels to ward off frost. Livestock may be stabled inside human quarters to share body heat. Water is melted over fires, sometimes boiled to keep it from freezing entirely. Every action, every plan is small, precarious, and vital. Yet amidst the suffering, life continues in stubborn bursts. Guards swap stories to pass the time. Children, if any remain, laugh briefly when a dog tumbles in snow. Someone quietly carves figures from scraps of wood, leaving them where others might find them. Small acts of humanity persist even when the winter wants to strip the world down to hunger and ice. By nightfall, the castle is quiet but alert. Frost creeps along the walls, catching moonlight like diamonds on stone. You curl up in a corner of straw bedding, listening to the groan of timber and the muffled sounds of animals. The siege is far from over. The cold has claimed some, weakened others, and left all of you more aware of fragility than ever before. Outside, the snow continues its quiet descent, indifferent to plans, sieges, or prayers. And so you wait, shivering, hungry, alive, knowing that medieval winter doesn't just freeze the body, it tests the very spirit of survival. The candles flicker in the monastery, their weak light stretching long shadows across cold stone walls. You wrap your cloak tighter, not just against the draught seeping through the cracks, but against the existential weight of the world outside. Monks move silently, carrying censers, writing in illuminated manuscripts, or simply sitting with their hands folded staring at frozen windows. It's winter, deep and relentless, and the chill seems to seep into the soul itself. You realise quickly that medieval clergy were not immune to frostbite, even in sanctuaries that were supposed to protect them. The monastery is one of the few places with relative stability. Food is rationed carefully, stored in cellars, barns and granaries that have survived multiple winters. Water runs from a well that hasn't frozen, thanks to careful design and some clever wooden coverings. The monks track the heavens and keep records of weather, not just for faith, but to understand the fragile balance between nature and survival. You marvel at their dedication. They note lunar phases, solar cycles and storms, scribbling in Latin with ink that sometimes freezes in the quill. There's a quirk to this winter. A meteor has streaked across the night sky recently, bright enough to be mistaken for divine judgment. The abbot speaks of it cautiously, writing in the annals that it was a sign of God's will, but leaving space for interpretation. You watch him, quill poised, wondering if the meteor frightened him or simply inspired him. The truth of it, like much in these winters, is ambiguous. The monk's routine is quiet and exacting. Each prayer is whispered. Each meal is eaten in near silence. You notice that the herbs they use for medicine are carefully dried and preserved. They make poultices from willow bark, poultices to fight fever, and teas from sage and rosemary to stave off infection. Some remedies are surprisingly effective. Others, you suspect, are faith in a cup. Regardless, they persist. Survival is as much about ritual as nutrition. And here's your quirky detail. One monk is known to have kept a pet raven during a particularly harsh winter, claiming it was both a companion and a weather predictor. It would caw loudly when a storm approached, giving the monastery a kind of early warning system, if you could interpret its cries correctly. The bird also stole bits of bread from unsuspecting novices, adding a note of mischief to the otherwise solemn days. Meanwhile, scholarly debate rages silently through the monastic halls. Were these long winters caused by divine displeasure, natural cycles, or some alignment of celestial forces? Some argue that volcanic eruptions decades earlier contributed to the unusually cold temperatures. Others insist that it's simply a pattern of the Earth's climate, long before humans had any measurable influence. The monks, for their part, record both possibilities just in case. Outside, the wind whistles through the eaves. Snow drifts against the stone walls, piling higher with each passing day. You step outside briefly, feeling the cold bite through your cloak, and notice the fields are buried under white. Livestock huddle together, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Trees are black and skeletal, their branches coated with ice. You realise that this cold has a quiet, relentless way of reshaping the world, of teaching lessons in patience, endurance, and humility. Inside again, the monks gather for vespers. Their voices rise in quiet harmony, echoing across the stone arches. There's warmth in that sound, a contrast to the frozen world outside. You sit quietly, listening, letting the chant seep into your bones. In these frozen centuries, knowledge, faith, and small acts of ingenuity, like heating water over small stoves or preserving herbs, or simply keeping a fire alive, are as crucial as any sword or shield. As night falls, you can hear the creak of timber and the whisper of wind against the monastery walls. Outside, the snow continues to fall, relentless and quiet. But inside, there's ritual, there's purpose, there's a strange kind of life persisting despite the freeze, and you realise that even in the harshest winters, survival isn't just about warmth or food, it's about the little things that keep hope alive. You huddle closer to the barn, teeth chattering as the wind slices across the courtyard. The cold isn't just outside, it's inside, creeping through the wooden beams, sliding down the stone floors and settling into your very bones. Livestock becomes more than food or wealth here. They are portable heaters. Sheep, cows, even pigs huddle together for warmth, and desperate villagers do the same, curling alongside them in tiny lofts or barn corners. You imagine the smell: hay, animal fur, and human sweat mingling into a pungent but comforting perfume. Survival, you realise, is as much about warmth as it is about sustenance. Medieval barn design becomes a matter of life and death during such winters. Straw is layered thickly, not just for bedding but as insulation. Animals are fed whatever they can graze or scavenge, with special care given to pregnant ewes and cows producing milk. You watch someone stir hay, tossing it into corners to create mini heat pockets. It's methodical, it's desperate, and it's clever. You might think humans are the only ones struggling here, but the animals have their own challenges. Snowdrifts bury food, water troughs freeze solid. Even the barns are drafts in places, letting in bitter gusts that make animals huddle tighter. The cold is relentless, unfeeling, indifferent to status, breed, or loyalty. And if you're not careful, frostbite and disease can sweep through livestock as fast as through human villages. Here's a quirky footnote. Some peasants reportedly kept chickens indoors, not just for warmth, but because the birds would lay eggs more reliably in warmer air. Others would drag goats or even cows into kitchens at night, ostensibly to share body heat, creating cramped, chaotic living spaces that smelled like manure and cooked bread simultaneously. Survival came with compromises and odours, lots of odours. The cold also forces humans to innovate in other ways. Water is melted over stoves, snow is boiled to prevent ice formation, and barns are strategically stacked to act as windbreaks for nearby houses. Children are taught to recognise which animal is most likely to survive the frost, a cruel but practical education. Every day becomes a series of calculated risks and small victories. And there's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much medieval Europeans relied on livestock as heaters. Some historians argue it was common knowledge, practical necessity. Others suggest it was regional, mostly in Northern Europe, and dependent on social class. Either way, the images of humans pressing against animals to share warmth are both funny and grim, a snapshot of ingenuity under duress. You step outside briefly, shivering, to check on a frozen trough. The ice cracks under your fingers, and you watch it slowly reform, layer by layer, as the cold continues its relentless work. The sky is grey, the wind moans like a distant beast, and snowdrifts curl around fence posts and barn doors. You realise that life now revolves entirely around warmth, and even a small misstep, a frozen hand, a lost straw bundle, can mean illness or death. Inside, the barn hums with life. Sheep snuffle, cows low softly, and pigs shuffle in the straw. You curl into a tight ball next to a cow, stealing its heat like a human blanket. The world outside is merciless, but in this small, chaotic barn there is warmth, there is life, and there is hope. It's not much, but it's enough. Night falls slowly, black and quiet, leaving you in the hum of breathing animals and the soft crackle of fire-heated water. You close your eyes, letting the combined warmth of hay, animal, and fire seep into your bones. Tomorrow you'll wake cold, hungry maybe, but alive. Because in medieval winters, sometimes survival itself is the grandest victory. You step outside and the world is almost unrecognisable. The snow has piled higher than you expected, drifts forming strange hills that block paths and collapse roofs. The air is brittle, biting through even the thickest layers of wool. Villagers shuffle past, faces red from windburn, eyes squinting against the glare, and mouths pressed tight to keep the cold out. This is the deep freeze of 1430, a winter so relentless it feels as though the world itself has stopped, holding its breath under ice and shadow. Crops have long since vanished beneath frozen soil, rivers are sheets of white glass, and livestock huddle in barns, their collective warmth the only relief from the unyielding chill. The cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's a formidable opponent. Snowdrifts bury fences, collapse walls, and even topple weak trees. Paths that were familiar just days ago are now treacherous, with hidden ice pockets that can snap ankles, or worse. You notice that people walk in single file, testing the ground before stepping fully, their movements slow, deliberate, cautious. Even a small misstep could mean frostbite, a twisted ankle, or a fall into a frozen ditch. The air smells faintly metallic, the tang of iron mixed with smoke from hearth fires. a scent that reminds you that humans and animals alike are locked in a fight to survive. Inside, homes are barely warmer than the outdoors. Firewood is precious, every spark counts. Families gather close together, blankets layered over clothing, huddling for warmth as the wind howls through cracks in the stone and wood. Hunger gnaws relentlessly, sharper in cold weather. You chew on boiled roots and dried grains, wondering if it's enough to last another day, another week, another month, and if not, what choices you may be forced to make. Here's your quirky historical fact. During this deep freeze, some villagers reportedly covered their windows with animal skins to keep out drafts, cutting them to fit with scissors or knives that had long since rusted from damp. It wasn't stylish, it was functional, desperate, and slightly terrifying, giving houses a shadowy, cave-like atmosphere inside. You imagine living with only the dim light of a fire and faint sunlight filtered through stretched hides. Not cozy, but effective. The winter forces not only physical adaptation, but mental endurance. People invent new ways to move, carry, and ration. Frozen rivers become roads for sleds and carts. Livestock are moved into tighter barns for shared warmth. Communities band together or break apart under the pressure. And as always, there's debate among chroniclers about how much the cold truly disrupted society. Some argue that populations were resilient, learning to cope and innovate. Others insist that the repeated winters caused long-term demographic and economic damage, shaping the trajectory of medieval Europe for decades. You notice the faint scent of bread in one corner of the village. A baker's family is using a small wood-fired oven to salvage what they can, though flour is scarce and yeast is weak from the cold. Even small successes feel monumental. Every loaf represents not just nourishment but morale, a fragile flame against the surrounding ice. The villagers treat it as such, sharing cautiously, guarding the warmth it provides in more ways than one. Outside, the frozen landscape stretches endlessly. Hills shimmer under a pale sun, roads vanish beneath snow, and tree branches crack under the weight of frost. You wrap your cloak tighter, feeling the chill in your bones, and realize that winter is not a season here. It's a master, indifferent, and uncompromising. Every movement is calculated, every action is survival. By nightfall, the village is quiet but tense. Snow continues to fall, soft yet unrelenting, blanketing the world in white. Fires burn low. People curl in corners, animals huddle together, and the wind moans against the walls. The deep freeze has claimed its presence, and you understand that this is more than a hardship. It is a test, one measured in patience, endurance, and sheer human stubbornness. And tomorrow, the frozen trial continues. You open your hands to grasp a piece of meat, only to discover that it's rock hard, frozen to the point of being almost unchewable. Salt, once your ally in preserving food, has become a scarce commodity. Winter in this period isn't merely inconvenient, it's devastating. Without proper salt, meat spoils quickly despite the cold, and what remains edible is often rationed down to barely a meal a day. The smell of rot mingles with the crisp, icy air, an unsettling reminder that survival isn't guaranteed. Every household wrestles with these constraints, improvising, trading, and, occasionally, stealing just to stay alive. You see farmers scraping frozen soil for root vegetables. Cabbage, turnips, and beets are dug out with iron spades, the earth hardened under layers of frost. Bread supplies are low, and bakers have begun stretching dough with anything that can absorb moisture, from crushed oats to boiled straw. Some families resort to eating bark or lichens to supplement meagre rations. Hunger is a constant companion, gnawing at the body and mind alike. People whisper that children are becoming skeletal. Livestock sometimes die in the barns, unable to digest frozen fodder. Salt, the most basic preservative, has become a form of currency. You trade a few bushels of grain for a handful of coarse salt, knowing that without it, meat and fish will rot before the next thaw. Merchants navigate treacherous snow-covered roads, trying to bring provisions to towns cut off by drifts. Avalanches, ice and frostbite make every delivery a gamble. And when supplies finally arrive, the most vulnerable, poor families, widows and children, often get the least. Here's your quirky historical fact. In some towns during these brutal winters, people reportedly boiled meat in urine to try and preserve it longer. A desperate, pungent method, but it sometimes worked. You wrinkle your nose imagining the taste, but in that environment, Even the most revolting practices were acceptable if they kept families alive. Survival required not just skill, but a willingness to bend morals and stomach alike. The cold also shaped social dynamics. Communities become tightly knit, or fractious. Neighbours help each other haul frozen fodder, mend torn clothing, or share the last pieces of bread. Yet distrust simmers beneath the surface. Hoarding, theft, and accusations of cheating are common. Some argue that harsh winters reshaped medieval society, reinforcing hierarchical structures because the wealthy could store grain and preserve salt, while the poor struggled to survive. Others suggest that such winters strengthened communal bonds, forcing shared labour and mutual protection. You huddle near a small hearth in the corner of your home. The fire is weak but sustaining, and you wonder how long it can last. Outside, snowflakes cling to the window, dripping as they melt from the slight warmth inside. Livestock in nearby barns breathe thick clouds of mist, warming each other and occasionally spilling heat into nearby human quarters. Your hands are raw from chopping wood and scraping ice, but the effort is necessary. Every action keeps the frost at bay for another few hours, perhaps another night. Volcanic eruptions from decades past, scholars debate, may have contributed to these icy conditions. Ash in the upper atmosphere could have reflected sunlight, dimming the warmth and shortening growing seasons. Others argue that shifts in ocean currents, known only in retrospect, led to unusually harsh winters in northern Europe. Either way, the result is the same: scarcity, cold, and hardship. Night comes early, long before your body's ready to rest. You sip from a thin broth, savouring its faint warmth, and watch the snow accumulate outside, blanketing the village in white. You feel exhaustion in every muscle and a gnawing hunger that won't be quieted. But you survive, and in that survival you find a grim sense of triumph. Medieval winter may take its toll, but it cannot entirely break those who endure. You notice a subtle haze in the sky, a muted orange sun struggling to rise above snow-laden rooftops. Farmers whisper about distant volcanoes they've never seen, but whose smoke seems to choke the horizon. Decades ago, massive eruptions sent ash high into the atmosphere, and now, years later, Europe is paying the price. Summers fail to provide warmth, winters grow longer, and crop yields dwindle year after year. You chew on a piece of hardened bread, tasting more grit than flavour, and realise that survival isn't just about enduring today, it's about anticipating tomorrow in a world reshaped by forces far beyond your control. The ash from eruptions like Somalas and Kuwait didn't just tint sunsets, it cooled the planet, altered rainfall, and caused widespread famine. Medieval communities, dependent on stable weather cycles, are caught off guard. You watch neighbours discussing grain shortages in hushed tones, the weight of desperation in every gesture. Livestock are thinning, children are gaunt, families are rationing salt and preserved meat as if every day could be their last. It's a subtle, invisible war waged by the atmosphere itself. Merchants struggle to bring supplies over frozen rivers and snow-blocked roads. You see wagons stuck in drifts, oxen collapsing under the load, and drivers shouting in frustration. The markets are chaotic. Prices spike. Flour becomes precious, salt rarer than gold. People barter fervently, negotiating every handful of grain and every scrap of preserved fish. The air smells of smoke, wet wool, and the faint tang of fear. Here's your quirky historical fact. Some chroniclers record that in Iceland people were forced to survive by eating tallow, lichens, and even moss mixed with water. It's not appetizing, it's not enough. But it's a form of survival, a desperate adaptation in a world where volcanic ash had turned familiar seasons into uncertain nightmares. You imagine the gnawing hunger and the ingenuity needed to survive under such conditions, and shiver despite your layered cloak. Scholars debate the exact role of volcanic activity in these prolonged cold periods. Some argue eruptions were the primary trigger for Europe's Little Ice Age, citing ice core data showing sulfuric acid particles in the atmosphere. Others contend that solar minima and shifting ocean currents played equal, if not greater, roles. The truth is likely a complex interplay of factors, and for those living through it, explanations offer little comfort. The ash doesn't care if you understand it. It kills crops, stiffens rivers, and makes winter unbearable. You walk past a frozen pond where ice has thickened unnaturally, and notice small cracks radiating across its surface. The local children use it for skating, shouting and laughing, unaware of how fragile the ice beneath their feet truly is. You almost envy their ignorance. Meanwhile, adults labour to gather firewood, repair barns, and thaw water supplies. Every action feels urgent, precarious, and necessary. Mistakes could mean frostbite, death of livestock, or worse. Even religion adapts. Prayers for rain, sun, and warm soil are whispered more frequently. Clergy warn of divine punishment, while others quietly acknowledge that the earth itself seems to have conspired against humanity. You witness monks and nuns cataloguing strange weather patterns, strange celestial events, and the consequences of famine, trying to make sense of forces that no human hand could control. Their records will survive even if their contemporaries suffer and perish. By nightfall, you return to your modest home. Smoke curls from the hearth, carrying a fragile warmth that doesn't quite reach your fingertips. You eat the last of your stored root vegetables, feeling their sustenance more in spirit than in satisfaction. Outside, the snow continues, drifting silently, layering over everything, reshaping the familiar landscape. And you realise that survival during medieval winters isn't a single heroic act. It's the slow accumulation of small, tireless adaptations against an indifferent sky. The tavern smells like wet wool, stale ale, and burnt wood, but somehow that's comforting. You step inside, shaking snow from your cloak, and notice the warmth. Modest, flickering, alive. Travellers and villagers alike crowd the space, not just for the drink, but for a reprieve from the relentless winter outside. A fire crackles in the hearth, casting shadows across rough-hewn tables. Laughter, cautious, dry, almost ironic, rises as someone tells a story about the frost snapping a neighbour's roof off during the night. For a brief moment, the cold feels secondary, a background character rather than the main antagonist of life. You grab a mug of warm ale, the liquid slightly cloudy from the yeast, and spices added to stretch it farther. It's barely more than a comfort, but it fills the belly and tempers the chill creeping along your bones. Around you, villagers play dice, swap gossip, and occasionally argue over the last piece of bread someone thought they reserved. Outside, the wind rages, and the snow piles against windows in unnatural drifts, but inside, for a fleeting hour or two, you feel human again. The tavern also functions as a hub for news. Merchants speak of roads blocked by snow and ice, of failed shipments, of livestock lost to frostbite. Travellers warn of avalanches in the mountains, frozen rivers swallowing horses, and towns running low on firewood. Even the local priest stops by, carrying a lantern and offering quiet words about endurance, prayer, and patience. You sip the ale, listen, and let the stories seep into your understanding of the wider world. Medieval winters are not just local inconveniences. They ripple across continents, changing trade, population movement, and daily life in ways subtle and catastrophic. Here's your quirky fact. Some taverns in Northern Europe during particularly harsh winters would brew flavoured snow ale, mixing melted snow with beer, herbs, and whatever spices could be found. It was warming, slightly intoxicating, and probably just a touch disgusting. People drank it anyway, claiming it helped stave off frostbite and despair simultaneously. You grimace imagining the taste, but survival often involves embracing small absurdities. The social dimension of tavern life is also fascinating. Scholars debate whether these spaces acted as informal centres of community resilience. On one hand, people shared resources, exchanged information, and maintained morale. On the other, such gatherings could also accelerate the spread of disease, as plagues often did in winter when people crowded indoors. You notice that while laughter abounds, caution and wariness thread through every gesture. Warmth is a gift, fleeting and precious, not to be taken lightly. Outside, the winter continues its relentless march. You glance toward the horizon where the sun barely rises, a pale disk fighting through grey clouds. The snow makes everything uniform. Fields, roads, buildings, blurring distinctions and forcing everyone to move carefully, deliberately. Even travel a few miles can take hours. Frost bites unguarded hands, ice coats roofs and streets, and hidden crevices threaten sudden injury. The tavern offers a reprieve, yes, but only temporarily. Eventually you must return to the outside world, where survival depends on planning, adaptability, and sheer stubborn endurance. You watch a group of children outside tossing snowballs at one another, laughing despite thin clothing and cold feet. For a moment it's almost beautiful, a small rebellion against the season's tyranny. But adults quickly call them inside, aware that hypothermia comes quietly and fatally. You feel a pang of sympathy for the playful innocents, knowing full well how fragile life is in these frozen months. By nightfall, the tavern empties slowly. Travellers leave to continue their journeys, villagers head home to huddled families, and the fire dwindles to glowing embers. You linger just a moment longer, savouring the warmth and companionship. Outside, the wind howls, snowdrifts rise, and winter's shadow stretches longer. Inside, human ingenuity, humour, and resilience cling stubbornly to life, providing a small oasis of hope in an otherwise merciless landscape. The river groans beneath hooves and wheels, a brittle, crystalline sound that makes you hesitate mid-step. You're part of a small cavalry detachment, the snow crunching under your horse's shoes, and ahead lies a frozen crossing no sane person would attempt, except that your commander insists it's the only route. The ice stretches solid, deceptive in its brilliance, reflecting the pale winter sun like a mirror. And you can't help noticing just how wrong this feels. History will remember it as the winter of horses on ice, a bold, reckless manoeuvre that teeters between genius and disaster. Your horse shivers beneath its fur blanket, nostrils steaming as it snorts at the wind. Every hooffall resonates, sending tiny vibrations through the ice, and you grip the reins tighter, heart hammering. The ice creaks, small cracks spiderwebbing outward, and you pray silently that your path holds. Behind you, other riders follow in careful formation, each relying on the one in front. It's a dance of trust and fear. One miscalculation, one patch of thin ice, and chaos ensues. The soldiers joke nervously, trying to mask panic. You hear laughter, high-pitched and brittle, and realise it's a defence mechanism as much as a social ritual. Hypothermia is creeping into fingers, faces, and boots. Small rivers of sweat freeze on cheeks, forming stinging icicles. Breath clouds in thick puffs fogging the world ahead. Still, forward they go, because retreat would be worse, because orders exist, because sometimes survival is sheer stubbornness. Here's a quirky fact. Medieval cavalry sometimes added hobnails to the horse's shoes to improve grip on ice. In theory, it helps. In practice, some horses slipped anyway, crashing into companions and sending riders sprawling into snowbanks. You imagine a scene of mounted chaos, metal clattering on ice, hooves skidding, and soldiers swearing in multiple languages. Somehow, most survive, but the lesson is clear. Winter amplifies every risk, every error, and every misjudgment. And scholars argue endlessly about whether these manoeuvres were brilliant or foolhardy. Some say the frozen rivers provided strategic advantages, allowing troops to outflank enemies and reach territories normally impassable. Others insist commanders were gambling with human lives, and that the victories achieved were almost accidental. You can't help but notice that from the saddle, the frozen landscape feels like a silent jury, judging every decision, punishing even minor miscalculations. The scenery is stark, hauntingly beautiful. Snow-covered banks rise on either side, dotted with skeletal trees. The river stretches endlessly, solid and silent, yet beneath it the water still flows, impatient and invisible. You glimpse a fox scampering across a drifted bank, pausing to watch the human parade of armoured horses and rattling carriages. Nature continues its own rhythm, indifferent to human ambition, indifferent to frostbitten toes and frozen water troughs. You notice small adaptations too. Riders tie extra furs around limbs, hoist sacks of hay to prevent horses from slipping, and tap frozen hooves with sticks to test the ice ahead. Survival in this context is precision, caution, and improvisation. And yet there's thrill too. A wild, nervous energy that surges through the group as they defy winter's normal rules. By the time the sun dips below the horizon, casting a pale silver glow across the ice, you're exhausted, but still mounted. The crossing is complete, the immediate danger past. You dismount, knees trembling, boots soaked through, and realise that winter, for all its cruelty, also fosters resilience and audacity. In the frozen world, each successful step, each careful manoeuvre, is a triumph. And yet, the ice remains patient, waiting silently for the next mistake, the next misjudgment, the next rider to test its mercy. The mountains loom above you, dark and skeletal against the pale winter sky, their peaks lost in drifting snow. You follow a narrow path barely visible under fresh drifts, aware that a misstep could send you tumbling down the slope. The avalanches have already claimed villages, barns, and entire pathways. Some communities have vanished entirely, their remnants buried beneath white tombs of ice. It's quiet in a way that's almost alive, the hush of snow broken only by distant cracks as frozen masses shift and settle. A reminder that winter doesn't just freeze life, it can erase it entirely. You step carefully, boots crunching over icy rocks. The air smells sharp, metallic, and faintly of pine resin carried on the wind. Livestock has been moved far from the slopes. Villagers stockpile wood and hay in lower valleys, and shepherds stay alert for the first signs of cracking snow. Even a seemingly small drift can trigger catastrophe. One wrong sound, one sudden shift in temperature, and hundreds of tons of snow can tumble downward in seconds, swallowing everything in its path. Here's a quirky fact. Some alpine villages, desperate to reduce avalanche risk, would intentionally dig channels into steep slopes to control snowflow, or light small controlled fires to destabilize loose snow. It's engineering in extremis, a combination of intuition, trial and error, and sheer luck. The techniques were rudimentary but surprisingly effective, a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. You pause to watch the white expanse above you, noting subtle changes in the snowpack, a shift here, a fissure there. Scholars debate whether medieval peoples truly understood avalanche science, or if survival was mostly instinct and observation. Either way, they adapted quickly. Those who didn't are now part of the frozen landscape, a silent reminder of winter's indifference. You feel a shiver that isn't entirely from the cold. The mountains are alive in ways humans cannot fully command, and the snow holds both beauty and threat in equal measure. Even monasteries weren't safe. In high valleys, isolated religious communities sometimes found themselves buried for weeks, cut off from supplies. Small flocks of sheep became both heating sources and food, their presence crucial for survival. You notice your hands stiffen in the biting wind, realizing that even when indoors, the mountains impose themselves on every action, every breath. Winter in the Alps is absolute. It's a master of the environment, unforgiving, and entirely patient. Despite the danger, life persists. Children play in snowdrifts away from avalanche-prone slopes. Farmers carve paths to water sources. Small fires burn in stone hearths, their smoke curling upward into grey skies. The rhythm of survival, gathering, rationing, monitoring, is slow, deliberate, and unending. Every action has consequences. Every inaction is potentially fatal. It's a discipline born of necessity, honed over generations. You glimpse the distant sound of bells, warning of a storm or movement in the snow. The villagers respond immediately, digging trenches, shoring up paths, moving livestock, and alerting neighbouring communities. Winter demands vigilance, and human ingenuity rises to meet it, but only just. The balance is delicate. The margin for error is tiny. By nightfall, the mountains settle into a silent, suffocating quiet. Fires glow in isolated homes and barns, but the slopes above continue to groan, whispering of potential disaster. You huddle in your shelter, listening to the wind whistle through gaps in the stone, aware that tomorrow the mountains and snow will still be there, testing endurance, patience, and courage. Survival is not guaranteed. It is fought for, every frozen day. You clank through the snow in armour that weighs more than your resolve, the cold metal pressing into your shoulders, numbing your limbs. The battlefield isn't just hostile because of enemies, it's hostile because of winter itself. Snow blankets the earth in deceptive uniformity. Mud has frozen into jagged ridges. Rivers you thought you could ford are frozen slick sheets of ice. This is winter warfare, and it's far less glamorous than any song or tale would suggest. Armour rattles, boots slip, swords frost over. Even the strongest knight can succumb to cold before reaching the enemy. You notice frost forming on eyelashes and hair, and realise that every breath is visible, every movement amplified by the quiet crunch of snow. Horses stamp impatient, their breath steaming, hooves slipping. Supplies are frozen solid, rations brittle and meagre. Commanders bark orders, but winter dulls comprehension. Soldiers misstep, fall, and curse the frost more than their enemies. In a way, nature has become an ally to those on defence, a cruel partner that favours patience and punishes impatience. Here's a quirky fact. During one winter campaign, soldiers reportedly coated their swords with animal fat to prevent rust from damp, frozen conditions. It worked to a degree, though you can imagine the smell, the stickiness, and the awkward handling when combat begins. It's small, clever adaptations like this that sometimes determine whether a campaign succeeds or fails, and whether men live or die. Scholars debate how winter shaped military strategy in medieval Europe. Some argue commanders deliberately timed attacks to exploit frozen terrain, crossing rivers and marshes that would normally slow armies. Others insist it was sheer desperation, forcing armies into perilous winter manoeuvres they might have avoided in fair weather. Either way, winter is not passive. It's an active participant, influencing decisions, morale, and even survival. You trudge through snowdrifts, each step exhausting, every inch of armour chilling your core. Soldiers grumble about frostbite, about food, about the delay in battle, but they keep moving, because stopping means succumbing to the cold. Horses neigh softly, snorting frost into the air, their panic reflected in human anxiety. Every misstep risks injury. Every frozen river crossing carries the possibility of disaster. It's less a test of skill than endurance, and endurance is running thin. Winter changes everything, including logistics. Supply lines freeze or collapse. Food rots in cold and damp despite frost. Troops huddle in makeshift shelters, sharing heat, rationing whatever warmth and nutrition they can. Small mistakes magnify. A lost boot, a broken harness, or a misread ice patch can be fatal. The battlefield itself is as much a challenge as the opposing force. At night you huddle with comrades in frozen trenches or icy barns. The snow continues to fall outside, muffling sounds, cloaking movements, and making everything eerily silent. Conversation is low, cautious. Exhaustion is universal. You notice a strange beauty in the pale glow of moonlight over the frozen fields, but its beauty tempered with fear. Even the stars seem distant, indifferent to the human struggle below. By dawn the army is battered but alive. Some horses are lost. Frostbite claims fingers and toes. Morale is thin, but survival is itself a victory. The cold remains, relentless, indifferent, testing skill, endurance, and human resilience alike. Winter, in medieval warfare, is not a backdrop. It is a formidable adversary, and anyone who underestimates it pays a silent, often icy, price. The town square is crowded, voices raised, snow crunching under boots. Hunger hangs over everyone like a persistent fog. This is the bread riots of winter, a recurring medieval spectacle when empty bellies turn anger into action. Prices spike because the cold has destroyed crops, frozen rivers have delayed shipments, and what little grain remains is hoarded by those who have it. You can feel the tension radiating off the crowd, men with fists clenched, women clutching their children, and bakers trying desperately to appease the throng. One misstep could ignite chaos. You watch as villagers pound on doors demanding bread, flour, and some explanation for their suffering. The guards attempt to maintain order, boots stamping in the snow, but their authority feels fragile under the weight of cold, hunger, and desperation. In the winter, every small frustration is amplified. Misery is contagious, spreading through the town like frost through the trees. The empty bellies make voices louder, movements sharper, and tempers far shorter than they would be in fair weather. Here's a quirky historical note. In some riots, peasants reportedly threw frozen vegetables at officials, sometimes aiming with surprising accuracy. Carrots and turnips became projectiles of protest, flying through the air with the subtle vengeance of those who have nothing left to lose. It's an image both absurd and terrifying. People armed with nature's frozen remnants, challenging authority with what little they have. Scholars debate how much these winter riots influence social structure. Some argue they pressured rulers into reforming taxation, regulating grain prices, or improving storage systems. Others suggest the riots were episodic, largely symbolic, and often violently suppressed, leaving long-term change minimal. Either way, winter conditions amplified the stakes, turning economic frustration into direct confrontation. You see people bargaining, pleading and shouting, their breath fogging in the icy air. Children cling to parents' skirts. Elders shake heads in worry and fatigue. Fires from nearby homes struggle against the wind, smoke curling weakly toward a grey sky. Even merchants, who might normally remain insulated from unrest, are drawn in, balancing fear of destruction with profit. Every transaction, every glance, is loaded with unspoken tension. You notice small adaptive behaviours. Villagers move quietly between markets to avoid the thickest crowds. Some carry knives, not to fight, but to pry frozen loaves from boards or break crusted bread into manageable pieces. The cold is constant, shaping behaviour, decision-making and social interaction. Hunger is intensified, and survival instincts sharpen in ways that are both practical and brutal. And then comes the human creativity that always accompanies hardship. Some bakers, fearing looting, create secret caches of bread, while others publicly distribute small portions to appease the masses. Town councils try to mediate, sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously. You notice a rhythm emerging amid chaos: negotiation, protest, compromise. Winter has forced people to innovate, to bargain, and occasionally to revolt. As night falls, the square empties, leaving behind traces of footprints in snow, shattered ice, and discarded scraps of bread. Fires glow faintly, casting flickering shadows on stone walls. People retreat to homes that are cold, draughty, and barely habitable. Their bellies still not full, but their immediate danger past. Winter, once again, has reminded them that survival is as much about patience and cunning as it is about warmth or food. You ride in formation, the wind slicing across your face, the snow clinging stubbornly to your cloak. Behind you, hundreds of soldiers follow, teeth chattering, armour clanking, breath steaming in the frigid air. This is the king who froze his army, an infamous chapter in medieval winter history where ambition met frost in a clash. Neither man nor men fully survived. Orders were clear, morale high, or so you thought. But winter had its own plans, indifferent to strategy, bravery, or rank. Every step, every misjudged path is a gamble against ice, snow, and temperatures so low they numb both body and judgment. The campaign had begun with confidence. Maps plotted rivers as mere obstacles, mountains as negotiable boundaries, and frozen lakes as potential shortcuts. But the cold arrived earlier than expected, biting through gloves, mail, and leather. Horses faltered, wagons got stuck, rations froze solid, and morale began to crack long before the enemy was sighted. You see it now, men walking stiffly, frost forming on eyebrows and beards, eyes hollow from hunger and fatigue. Commanders bark orders, but even they are no match for hypothermia creeping slowly into every soldier's bones. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. One chronicler wrote that during this winter, soldiers tried warming their hands with embers inside leather gloves, a desperate measure that occasionally scorched skin but kept fingers from freezing entirely. Ingenious, horrifying, and necessary. It's a reminder that medieval survival often combined creativity with sheer discomfort. Scholars debate whether this campaign failed due to mismanagement or because winter was an unbeatable adversary. Some argue that the king underestimated the power of cold, believing valour and discipline could overcome frostbite and frozen supply lines. Others suggest that winter was merely the final straw, compounding logistical errors, poor planning, and insufficient local knowledge. Either way, the result was the same. A costly disaster where snow and ice decided the outcome more than swords or strategy. You notice the soldiers improvising constantly. Snow is packed under wagon wheels to provide traction. Extra cloaks are traded for warmth. Livestock are brought closer to the men for shared body heat. Fires are lit strategically to thaw rations and warm extremities. Every adaptation matters because the line between life and death is measured in degrees and inches, not courage or reputation. Outside, the landscape is merciless. Frozen rivers glint under a muted sun. Snowdrifts bury pathways and obscure landmarks. Visibility is poor, and one wrong turn can lead to disaster. You see tracks of animals and other humans, often indistinguishable in the blinding white. Every step is calculated. Every misstep could mean losing a man, a horse, or an entire detachment. By nightfall, the army settles, exhausted and diminished. Fires burn low, flickering shadows across pale snow and weary faces. The king is present, noting casualties, measuring morale, and perhaps silently cursing the frost itself. Outside, the wind howls through the tents and over the frozen ground. It is indifferent, patient, and eternal. Inside, soldiers huddle together, sharing warmth, hope, and whatever small rations remain. The lesson is clear. Winter can defeat even the most powerful kings, and in medieval campaigns, frost can be as deadly as any enemy sword. You step inside your small house, greeted by the familiar scent of smoke, wet wool, and the faint tang of stale food. The frost has crept through the walls, forming delicate ice patterns on the windows. Medieval homes are barely insulated. Drafty stone and thin wooden planks do little to stop the cold. You hang a tapestry over the door to trap warmth and pull your bed curtains close, hoping to preserve any heat you can manage. Window ice and bed curtains become tools for survival, shielding you from the relentless winter that seems to seep into every corner. The nights are the worst. Your breath fogs in the dim candlelight. The floorboards creak under the weight of snow packed outside, and every corner seems to whisper with the wind. You layer blankets and furs, sometimes sharing space with livestock to capture their body heat. Even small rooms feel vast and icy when the temperature drops below freezing for days on end. You try to sleep, but the cold steals comfort, and you shiver through the night, aware that your body's warmth is a fragile commodity. Here's a quirky fact. In some medieval homes, people would hang boughs of evergreens inside to provide insulation, mask drafts, and perhaps even ward off evil spirits. It was practical, decorative, and, in the biting cold, a minor psychological boost. The scent of pine mingled with smoke, offering a small illusion of warmth and cheer in a world dominated by frost. Scholars debate how much indoor adaptations like this actually improved survival rates. Some argue that layering, insulation with textiles, and animal companionship significantly mitigated hypothermia and illness. Others contend that the effectiveness was minimal, with mortality still high among the poor and elderly. Either way, these small acts demonstrate the ingenuity and resourcefulness people relied upon when nature refused mercy. You move around your home carefully, tending the fire. Coal and wood are precious. You rearrange furs, stack blankets, and ensure animals are near enough to provide supplemental warmth. Water has to be melted over the fire as the well is frozen. You sip a lukewarm drink, tasting more hope than flavour. Outside, the wind rattles loose shutters, rattling against your resolve and reminding you that the world beyond your walls is harsh and unyielding. The frost on the windows creates natural patterns, almost artistic in their symmetry. You trace them with a finger, marvelling at the tiny beauty that exists even amid hardship. It's a small distraction from the unrelenting cold outside, and a reminder that life continues to assert itself in subtle ways, even in the harshest conditions. Night deepens, and the room grows quieter. Snow drifts press against the house, hiding familiar pathways and making navigation outside treacherous. You huddle under the thickest blankets you own, feeling the shared warmth of your household. Every shiver, every small act, stacking firewood, tucking in blankets, keeping the hearth alive, is a measure of survival. And even as the frost creeps inside, you find a kind of fragile security in these routines, knowing that indoors, at least, there is a temporary shield against the relentless world beyond. By the end of night, sleep finally arrives, shallow and interrupted, but enough to prepare for another day. The cold persists, but so does life, stubbornly and quietly, in the small, heated refuge you've created. It's not comfort, it's survival, and in medieval winters, survival is victory. The church bells toll awkwardly, their metal cracked and brittle from the winter's relentless cold. You step inside the stone sanctuary, the warmth of the fire barely reaching your frozen hands. Outside, snow blankets the town, drifting over rooftops, streets and fields, but inside the air is heavy with incense and the muffled murmurs of prayer. This is when the bells froze mid-chime, a striking reminder that even sacred tools were not immune to the cruelty of medieval winters. The sound, stuttering and hollow, echoes eerily through the nave, adding an almost surreal quality to the otherwise familiar ritual. You watch as the clergy move carefully, their robes weighed down with frost and ice, candles flickering as the drafts try to snuff them out. Parishioners huddle together, sharing body heat, keeping children close. Even the priest struggles to hold a missal, fingers numb and stiff. Services are shorter, simpler, and more solemn than usual, reflecting both the season's hardships and the creeping fatigue that grips the community. The frozen bells serve as a metaphor for the year itself, partially functional, strained under pressure, but still striving to fulfill their purpose. Here's a quirky historical note. Some churches reportedly hung chains of iron from bell towers to help stabilize the frozen bells, while others would strike them only gently to avoid shattering the metal. These improvised solutions were a mix of superstition, practical necessity, and trial and error ingenuity. You can almost imagine the clumsy, cautious strikes echoing across snow-laden villages, sound muffled and distorted by frost, adding an unintentional rhythm to the winter's silence. Scholars debate whether these frozen bells were isolated incidents or widespread phenomena during the coldest periods of the Little Ice Age. Some argue that structural damage and frequent repair records indicate that bells often succumbed to prolonged freezing. Others believe that climate records, combined with anecdotal accounts, suggest these events were rare and noteworthy precisely because they were unusual. Either way, the frozen bells leave an indelible mark on both history and folklore. Outside, the village is quiet, save for the occasional scraping of snow from roofs or the distant cry of a bird struggling against the wind. People hurry from home to home, eyes down, hands tucked, mindful of slipping on icy cobblestones. Livestock stamp in barns, a low rumble of anxious breath rising to meet the wind. Even for the clergy, every task becomes a small calculation. How much warmth to sacrifice to maintain ritual? How long to leave doors open? Which paths to clear first? Every action carries weight in a season where one misstep could be deadly. Inside, you notice the congregation adjusting to the circumstances. They whisper prayers not only for spiritual guidance but for practical survival, for warmth, for food, for safe passage home. Candlelight casts long, shifting shadows, highlighting the frost creeping along window panes. It's a quiet, reflective adaptation to winter's uncompromising presence, a mixture of faith, ingenuity, and grim acceptance. By evening, the bells no longer ring fully, their stuttered chimes replaced by the murmur of candles and whispered prayers. You leave the church, boots crunching on snow, aware that winter will continue to challenge every aspect of life, from sacred rituals to daily survival. And yet, in these frozen moments, communities endure, adapt, and find ways to function despite the harshness pressing in from every side. The world is cold, unyielding, but human resilience persists, subtle and stubborn, like the faint glow of a candle in a long dark night. The world feels suspended in white, as if the snow itself has paused time. You trudge through deep drifts, each step heavier than the last, boots sinking, cloak weighed down by ice and wind. Around you, the villages, rivers, forests, and mountains are all coated in unbroken white, a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving. This is a world of snow, the cumulative memory of medieval winters preserved not only in chronicles, but in the bones, folklore, and resilience of those who endured them. Every hill, every frozen stream, every drifted valley holds a story of survival, ingenuity, and quiet suffering. You notice small adaptations that define life in these frozen centuries. Families huddle together in layered furs, livestock are brought indoors to share body heat, and food is rationed with careful precision. Villagers improvise, frozen meat is boiled in inventive ways, fires are strategically placed to maximize warmth, and children learn to navigate slippery roads from the first winter of their lives. The cold has shaped society, dictating where people live, how they travel, and even how they think. It's both a physical and psychological force, moulding behaviour and belief as much as it does the land. Here's your quirky historical note. Some communities reportedly use snow itself as insulation, piling it against walls or over roofs to prevent heat loss inside homes. A simple but effective solution, blending resourcefulness with necessity. You can imagine children playing on these snow walls, unaware that their creative amusement is also a vital contribution to family survival. Scholars debate the lasting influence of these winters on European society. Some argue the repeated cold spells drove innovation in agriculture, architecture, and trade, forcing people to think differently about food storage, building design, and seasonal planning. Others contend that the human cost, malnutrition, disease, and mortality, was catastrophic enough to slow development in some regions for decades. Either way, the winters left an indelible mark. They shaped minds, bodies, and culture, intertwining the natural world with human history in ways both subtle and profound. You watch the sun dip low over a frozen landscape, the pale light reflecting off the snow and turning the world into a glittering expanse of silver and blue. The rivers, once navigable and alive with trade, are frozen solid. The forests, which might otherwise provide sustenance, are coated in ice, difficult to traverse and dangerous. Every familiar landmark is transformed, reshaped and challenged by winter's relentless power. Yet life continues, stubbornly, in quiet, persistent ways. Children play briefly in snowdrifts, their laughter echoing faintly through the valleys. Adults work tirelessly, fetching firewood, tending animals, repairing buildings, and planning the next meal. Clergy record events, farmers adjust techniques, and families share warmth and resources wherever possible. Even in these harshest conditions, the human spirit asserts itself. Adaptation, resilience, and ingenuity are the hallmarks of survival, proving that winter, no matter how merciless, cannot entirely defeat life. By nightfall, the world is silent again, except for the soft whisper of snow drifting in the wind. You find shelter, gather warmth, and reflect on the endurance required to navigate centuries of frozen winters. The cold has claimed lives, altered landscapes, and rewritten history in subtle, pervasive ways. But the people who lived, worked, and persevered in these frigid times left a legacy of resilience that resonates across generations. Medieval winter was harsh, cruel, and indifferent, but human ingenuity, courage, and tenacity persisted, quietly defying the frost.